High above the Indian Ocean, disaster strikes.
The engine's on fire!
More than 10 kilometers in the air, all 4 engines of a British Airways 747 stop working.
Mayday, 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 Speedbird 9.
With no engines and little power, British Airways Flight 9 falls towards the ocean, from crashing into the sea. What has crippled their massive jet, threatening the lives of everyone on board?
Aviation history is filled with stories of incredible skill and survival in the face of disaster. Some incidents are remembered for their miraculous outcomes, while others remind us of the unpredictable dangers that can occur while flying. One such case is British Airways Flight 009, a flight that had to battle the impossible after flying through a volcanic ash cloud over Indonesia in 1982. The aircraft lost all power in mid-flight, and the crew had to manage an emergency landing without the help of their engines. It was a life-or-death situation, and the crew's ability to stay calm and think clearly saved the lives of everyone on board. So, what happened that day? Let's dive into the details of this incredible disaster and what happened next. On June 24, 1982, British Airways Flight 009, a Boeing 747-200, departed from London Heathrow, bound for Auckland, New Zealand. The aircraft was carrying 263 people, 248 passengers and 15 crew members, and was scheduled to make several stops along the way, including in Bombay, Kuala Lumpur, Perth, and Melbourne. The flight was progressing smoothly and at cruising altitude, which was 35,000 feet, when disaster struck unexpectedly. While over the Java Sea, near Jakarta, Indonesia, the aircraft flew directly into a volcanic ash cloud. The eruption was from Mount Galunggung, an active volcano located about 75 miles southeast of Jakarta. This cloud of ash was caused by the eruption, and it was large enough to spread over a wide area. What made the situation even more dangerous was the fact that the ash cloud was invisible to the naked eye, and at the time, the aircraft's radar systems couldn't detect it. The volcanic ash, made up of tiny particles, was very fine and dry, which meant that the crew had no warning and had no way of avoiding it. When the aircraft entered the ash cloud, the first immediate consequence was the failure of all 4 engines. The ash particles entered the engines, blocking the airflow needed for combustion and cooling. Normally, the engines would continue to operate without issue, but the volcanic ash caused a severe reduction in engine performance. This led to what is known as a flameout, where the engines stop running due to a lack of air and fuel mixture. This was an unprecedented event for aviation. It was the first time that an aircraft had lost all of its engines at 35,000 feet, and it posed an extremely rare but catastrophic risk. The crew had never faced a situation like this before. They immediately declared an emergency, which triggered several protocols to restart the engines. However, volcanic ash particles had melted inside the engines due to the high temperatures from combustion, and as the engines cooled, they formed a sticky residue inside, which made restarting incredibly difficult. The situation worsened as the plane continued to descend, and the crew's efforts to restart the engines proved unsuccessful at first. They were gliding through the air without any thrust from the engines, and the aircraft was slowly losing altitude. In addition to this, the plane's windshields became heavily damaged by the ash, making it nearly impossible for the crew to see outside. This further complicated their decision-making process because they could no longer rely on visual cues during the descent. With no power from the engines, the aircraft was descending at a relatively rapid rate, but the crew continued to work tirelessly. They manually controlled the glide path and started to look for a suitable place to land. They had no choice but to rely entirely on instrument readings, since external visibility was near zero. They were essentially flying blind and needed to act quickly to prevent the situation from worsening further. At this point, the crew made a critical decision. They were going to attempt a landing in Jakarta, even though they had limited fuel and no functioning engines. The situation was extremely dire, and it was unclear whether they could land safely at all. Yet, despite all the odds stacked against them, the crew continued to perform admirably, using every ounce of their training and skill to bring the plane down safely. Their calmness and methodical approach became key to the plane's eventual safe landing, despite all the challenges faced during this terrifying incident. What went wrong? The first major issue on British Airways Flight 009 occurred when the aircraft flew into the volcanic ash cloud. The ash cloud from Mount Galunggung, which had erupted earlier, contained fine particles that were invisible to the naked eye and undetectable by radar. As the Boeing 747 entered the cloud, the engines started to ingest these tiny particles. This disrupted the airflow inside the engines, leading to engine failures one by one. The fine volcanic ash particles melted inside the engines due to the heat of combustion. When the engines cooled during the descent, the molten ash solidified and caused a sticky residue to build up. This clogged the engines, choking their operation. Within minutes, all 4 engines failed, leaving the aircraft without any power at cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The loss of power from all engines was a critical situation. Flameouts, or complete engine failure, occurred on all 4 engines in rapid succession. This left the plane gliding without any thrust. The crew's immediate response was to attempt to restart the engines while trying to maintain control of the aircraft. But restarting engines in this situation was extremely difficult due to the ash residue blocking airflow and the engines being severely damaged by the volcanic particles. It was a rare and almost impossible scenario for an airliner, but the crew knew they had to act fast. As the aircraft descended into the ash cloud, the crew declared an emergency. They quickly made attempts to restart the engines while descending toward Jakarta. However, a major issue arose with communication. The plane was descending through the ash cloud, and because of the altitude and the interference from the volcanic ash, the crew faced difficulty in making clear contact with Jakarta Air Traffic Control. The message about the emergency was not immediately understood, and a misunderstanding led to confusion about the urgency of the situation. To make sure the gravity of the emergency was fully understood, another aircraft flying nearby had to relay the Mayday call for the British Airways flight. This aircraft communicated to Jakarta Air Traffic Control that the British Airways flight was in a critical situation, with all engines shut down and the crew struggling to regain control. This was an incredibly tense moment, as the aircraft had no engines and could not directly communicate with the controllers. The communication issues further added to the stress of the situation. How would the flight crew get the help they needed? Not only were they facing a technical emergency, but now they had to rely on others to ensure that air traffic controllers were aware of the critical nature of their situation. Every second counted as the plane continued its descent toward Jakarta, and the crew had to act quickly. As British Airways Flight 009 continued to lose altitude, the crew focused on restarting the engines while managing the aircraft's descent. The rate of descent was crucial. The crew needed to glide the aircraft down without crashing, and they did not have the luxury of having engines to provide any thrust. The glide ratio for a Boeing 747 without power is around 1 to 2.5, meaning for every 1,000 feet of altitude, the plane could travel about 2.5 miles forward. This gave the crew a limited but manageable distance to work with as they descended toward Jakarta. The crew's efforts to restart the engines were not immediately successful. As they descended through the ash cloud, however, the engines began to show signs of life. The solidified ash inside the engines started to break up slightly, allowing some airflow and giving the engines a chance to restart. But visibility remained poor, with ash particles still clogging the windshield and making it almost impossible for the pilots to see outside the cockpit. The pilots could not rely on visual cues and had to rely solely on their instruments, relying on Instrument Landing Systems ILS for guidance. They continued the descent without a clear view of the ground, relying on the instruments and their expertise. The fact that the engines started to show some signs of recovery during the descent was a turning point. However, the aircraft still had no thrust, and the descent had to be carefully managed. They had to glide at a safe speed, ensuring that the plane didn't drop too quickly, which could lead to a stall. It was a fine balance, and every move made by the pilots counted. Their ability to maintain control of the aircraft during this phase was critical to ensuring the safety of everyone on board. The pilots also faced issues with limited fuel. By the time they were descending toward Jakarta, the fuel levels had become quite low, adding an extra layer of urgency. The crew had to make every decision count. After descending through the ash cloud, and with the engine restart attempts progressing, the crew worked tirelessly to prepare the aircraft for an emergency landing. However, the landing was still going to be a major challenge with limited visibility and the possibility that the engines might fail again. The crew remained focused on the task, keeping calm under pressure, knowing that they had to bring the plane down safely without relying on engine power. This complex situation tested the crew's training and ability to make quick, life-saving decisions. The dramatic descent through the ash cloud, with engines failing and communication difficulties, highlighted how unpredictable aviation emergencies can be, especially when nature, like volcanic ash clouds, creates obstacles that cannot be avoided or predicted. Despite the chaos and confusion, the crew's professionalism and determination were key to guiding the aircraft toward its emergency landing in Jakarta. Now think about this. Not only were the engines out, but the visibility was almost zero. The windshields were covered in volcanic ash, essentially sandblasting them. The crew couldn't see anything outside, and yet, they had to rely on their instruments alone to guide them to a safe landing. Through sheer determination, the crew managed to restart one engine, then another, and soon they had enough power to keep the aircraft flying and descending at a controlled rate. This wasn't a perfect situation, but they were working with what they had. With the plane still in trouble, the crew relied entirely on their instruments to guide them for the landing. They had to ignore their inability to see outside and focus on the readings in front of them. Using the onboard navigation systems, they managed to control the descent. The aircraft's instruments were their only lifeline. Without visual guidance, they depended on the aircraft's technology to make their way safely to the airport. Despite the difficulties they faced during the flight, the crew of British Airways Flight 009 remained determined to land the aircraft safely. With all four engines failing and limited power, the crew had to focus on maintaining control of the aircraft as they made their descent toward Jakarta. The plane's altitude was decreasing rapidly, but the crew continued to rely on their training, skill, and onboard instruments to guide them. One of the significant challenges during the descent was engine number 2, which began surging. Engine surging occurs when the power output fluctuates unpredictably, causing instability. This is a dangerous situation, as the engine could lose power or even fail completely. Given the critical nature of the emergency landing, the crew had to make a quick decision to avoid further complications. To prevent the surging engine from causing more damage, the crew decided to shut it down. This was a difficult choice, as it reduced the number of functioning engines from 3 to 2. With only 2 engines providing power, the aircraft's performance became more limited, making the approach to Jakarta even more challenging. Despite the reduced power, the aircraft was still in the air, and the crew remained focused on making a safe landing. The decision to shut down the surging engine ultimately helped avoid the risk of catastrophic failure and allowed the pilots to concentrate on the remaining engines. The reduced power meant that the pilots had to rely even more on their skill and careful management of the descent. As the crew continued their descent, they had to execute a careful approach to Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta International Airport. With limited engine power and no ability to see outside the aircraft due to the ash covering the windshields, the pilots were reliant entirely on their instruments. They followed the instrument landing system, a set of guidelines that helps pilots land an aircraft using only the plane's internal navigation systems. Despite the difficulty, they were able to keep the aircraft on track for a safe landing. During the final stages of the approach, the crew continued to deal with other technical difficulties. The ash that had damaged the engines also caused further issues with visibility and the instruments, as the fine volcanic particles had infiltrated the plane's systems. The pilots had to carefully balance their remaining power while also managing the aircraft's descent speed, ensuring that the plane didn't fall too quickly or stall. Eventually, after an intense and nerve-wracking few minutes, British Airways Flight 009 reached Soekarno-Hatta International Airport in Jakarta. The crew executed a successful landing, despite all the challenges they had faced during the flight. The aircraft touched down safely, and the moment the wheels hit the runway, there was an overwhelming sense of relief both in the cockpit and in the cabin. For the 263 passengers and crew on board, the landing was a moment of intense relief and gratitude. The crew's calm and clear communication had ensured everyone followed safety procedures. Once on the ground, applause erupted as passengers realized they had survived an unimaginable ordeal. This incident highlighted the crew's exceptional skill and ability to stay composed under pressure. It also served as a wake-up call for the aviation industry, raising awareness about the dangers of volcanic ash clouds. The event emphasized how fine ash particles can severely damage aircraft engines, even at high altitudes. What was learned? The event also led to some important changes in aviation regulations. Airlines and aviation authorities started to take volcanic ash clouds much more seriously, revising flight routes to avoid areas where volcanic activity was occurring. Weather radars and other tools were also updated to better detect ash clouds, improving flight safety for the future. But beyond technology and safety measures, the British Airways Flight 009 incident showed just how critical it is for the flight crew to stay calm and make the right decisions in a crisis. The crew's training and quick thinking were the key to getting everyone safely on the ground. What could have happened? It's easy to wonder, what if the crew had failed to restart the engines? What if the ash cloud had been denser, or the visibility even worse? The truth is, the crew's skills and determination prevented a tragedy. They worked as a team, stuck to their training, and managed a miracle landing. This incident showed us that in aviation, anything can happen. And when something goes wrong, there's no room for panic, only for clear heads and quick decisions. The story of British Airways Flight 009 remains a powerful reminder of the unpredictability of flying and the incredible human strength that can shine through during a disaster. The volcanic ash cloud that nearly brought down a plane over Indonesia is now part of aviation history. The bravery and expertise of the crew saved 263 lives that day, and the lessons learned from their experience have made air travel safer for everyone. When you hear stories like this, you can't help but appreciate the skill and dedication of those who work in aviation. Have you ever wondered what would happen if something like this happened to your flight? Well, this story shows that with the right training and composure, even the most difficult situations can be overcome. Would you feel safe flying over volcanic regions after hearing this story? It's a good question to think about, especially considering how much we rely on airplanes for travel today. Stay safe and always be grateful for the unsung heroes who work behind the scenes in aviation.